All right, well, welcome everyone to another OSHA Quick Take with Conn Maciel Carey. And today we've got Rachel Conn and Megan Shaked, and they're going to talk about some upcoming or hot off the presses Cal OSHA standards that you should be aware of. So I'll turn it over to Rachel and Megan.
Thanks, Scott. I'm Rachel Conn, and I'm the chair of the California practice, and I'm here with my partner, Megan Shaked, and I will turn it over to her so she can give you the background on SB 553, the new California Workplace Violence Prevention Standard.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks for having us, Scott. Like Rachel said, I'm Megan Shaked with Conn Maciel Carey. I'm in both our OSHA practice and our employment law practice, and we are looking forward to our webinar coming up on Thursday, November 9th. We're going to be discussing workplace violence prevention. And like Scott mentioned, this is hot off the presses with a new piece of legislation passed by the California legislature and signed by Governor Newsom. And it's known as Senate Bill 553. And so one of the things that we're planning on getting into in the webinar is giving people a little bit of context and background into how we got here. For those of you who are kind of more intimately familiar with how Cal OSHA works, you might be thinking, wait a minute, this is California legislature, but what about Cal OSHA regulations? What's going on? So the kind of lay of the land at this point in time is that there has been for a number of years a workplace violence prevention, a Cal OSHA regulation in the context of healthcare. And in the meantime, there has been a rulemaking in place for Cal OSHA to have a general industry workplace violence prevention regulation, and that has been working through the Cal OSHA rulemaking. And as we know, these rulemakings can take a very, very, very long time. In the meantime, workplace violence is an issue. It's a priority for Cal OSHA, and they have put out guidance documents, kind of helping employers to try to think through the hazard of workplace violence in the workplace. Tell employers how they can, try to go about assessing that as a hazard and what to do about it. And there's quite a bit of guidance that the agency has pushed out, particularly in the retail industry, but it applies across the board, giving employers, things to think about, and reminding employers that they can currently use the injury and illness, the agency can currently use the injury and illness prevention program as a way to cite employers for perceived failure to address the risk of workplace violence So, meantime, for those of you, kind of following the news over the last few years, California has had quite a few very high-profile incidents of workplace violence, mass shootings, and so there was pressure at the legislative level to kind of move things along, and that's where Senate Bill 553 came from. So this worked its way through the legislature, and like I said, was passed by both houses and was signed by the governor, and will go into effect technically January 1st, 2024, but there are certain elements that will get rolled out in time. And so kind of the big highlight is that employers really across the board, there's some exceptions, and obviously healthcare employers are currently covered by the healthcare standard through Cal OSHA, but employers really across the board in general industry will now have a requirement to specifically address the risk of workplace violence in the workplace, have a plan in place. And there are some additional requirements that Rachel will get into. But we did kind of we'll start with a lot of that history because we think it's important for people to understand why this is such a priority for the legislature and the agency, and understand that this will continue to be a priority for the agency as they're specifically tasked under the new legislation to complete their rulemaking. So they have authority under the new legislation to enforce this when it goes into effect, but then they'll also at the same time have to be completing their own rulemaking, which is a little bit strange, but it will it's something that employers should be looking at now. And I'll turn it over to Rachel to kind of give a little bit more context into why that's so important right now.
Thanks, Megan. And even if you're an employer or a company that doesn't have California employees or doesn't have California facilities, this is really one to pay attention to because it's a first in the nation law. It's one where we know that Fed OSHA is going to be paying attention to. Doug Parker, when he was the head of Cal OSHA, he worked on the regulation, so he's familiar with it. So it's really one that we anticipate it's getting kicked off out here in California, but eventually we'll probably see something similar kind of make its way through the country and at the federal level. So it's really going to be a great opportunity for you to get an idea of what's coming down the pike, even though you may not be subject to it at this point. So as Megan mentioned, SB 553 really does or did three things, and we'll get into them in detail on the webinar, but just as a highlight here, one thing that it does is that it amends workplace violence prevention laws here in California. If you're an employer that has ever used a workplace violence prevention restraining order, now unions are going to be able to get those. And it's also expanded the scope to include harassment. So that's a tool that employers here can use, and it's going to get expanded. And we're going to talk about all the implications of that, good and bad. It amends the injury and illness prevention plan standard to include as part of one of the elements that you must have a workplace violence prevention program that is compliant with new labor code 6401.9. And then it adds that labor code, which is the big ticket item here that we're talking about. And that's going to require employers to have a workplace violence prevention program in place. And that's all employers unless you fall under a very narrow exception. So it's general industry. And the plan is going to have 12 elements to it. And one thing that we want to make sure employers are aware of is when you're looking at these elements, you may think, okay, I'm just going to throw a plan together and plug in, some pieces and we're good to go. But this is really going to be very fact specific, detail oriented, and it's going to take some time to evaluate and make sure you have the proper pieces in place. And one of the things that, as somebody who has worked on the healthcare prevention, violence prevention standard and litigated those cases, is there's a similar provision in that standard that we see here, and that's that it has to be specific to the work area and to the operations. And what that means is that employers just won't be able to have one plan for, every facility if they have several facilities in the state. And even if you have kind of a generic plan for your facility, they're really going to be making sure that you are covering, if there's operations that are different, there's facilities that are different, and we're going to jump into that and make sure that you have an idea of what Cal OSHA is going to expect. In addition to your plan, you're going to have to investigate all workplace violence incidents in your facility. And we're going to get into the definition of workplace violence because it doesn't just include the injuries. It includes psychological as well as stress. So it can be a very broad brush as to what's considered workplace violence. So you're going to have to investigate all of those. You're going to have to fill out a violent incident log for every incident and that's going to be pretty detailed along with those investigation reports. And we're going to talk about some of the other intersections of, for instance, employment law that's going to be implicated in things like that, because we're talking about employee privacy issues when we get into some really detailed violent incidents. The other piece of this is that there's employee training, and that training not only has to be at the beginning of when you roll out this program, which, by the way, has to be in place by July 1, 2024. So the plan, your training, your violent incident log. And I know that seems pretty far away, but, I can't believe we're already halfway through October. So I feel that July is going to be upon us very quickly. And again, there's going to probably be a lot of work to go in putting this plan together. So the training not only has to be at the time of when you put this in place, but it's annual, and it also has to be interactive. And we'll talk a little bit about what that's going to entail. And then lastly, there's a ton of record keeping requirements that are going to go along with this. So, hopefully you can tune in and we'll be able to give you the full comprehensive review of all of that. And as Megan mentioned, OSHA has been directed to continue to rulemaking on this. So this is going to be the floor of what we're going to see. It's possible that OSHA comes out with a regulation that has even additional requirements. We know that they have a draft that's in the works. They're planning on having additional advisory committee meetings. So it's certainly one that we're going to have to keep tracking, and that we'll track, and one to pay attention to. So Megan, I'll turn it over to you to see if you have anything else to close us out.
Yeah, that gives folks a sense of what we're going to get into during the webinar. There's a lot to cover. And one of the things that's really interesting about this topic is that if you, no matter how your organization might be structured and whose kind of desk this might fall into, we also want folks to be thinking through, how this might impact other teams, right? So workplace violence prevention, maybe it falls to a security team or a safety team or even HR, but whoever it falls to, you really want to kind of be thinking about the implications across the board. And Rachel mentioned one of the things we'll touch on is kind of these other employment law implications, issues like privacy and discrimination claims and requests for reasonable accommodation, and things that may not initially trigger your brain to think, oh, there's a connection between our workplace violence program and us managing the risk of these employment law claims. But we want to kind of have you start to think through the implications so that when you're implementing your program, you're aware of these. And this is, one of the reasons, or one of the insights that the agency has provided on why this rulemaking has taken so long is just this, that it's complicated and it implicates a lot of different subjects, and it can be emotionally fraught for people. And so, we're trying to kind of highlight some of those issues at the outset, at the beginning, so folks can prepare themselves and know, maybe a bigger team needs to be involved, or maybe we need to think through these things at the beginning. So we're, able to address them head on, and rather than having to react to a situation that you weren't quite prepared for. So, hoping to give folks a lot to think about, but also some, kind of concrete action items and deadlines, and some maybe encouragement to kind of work on this as early as possible to get things in place before those deadlines. And we're really looking forward to presenting the information, getting into some of the detail, and kind of facilitating folks' questions. See what with new legislation and rulemaking, the big question in our mind is always, how's this going to work, practically speaking? And we've seen this play out in the healthcare context. But this is, like Rachel said, general industry. So we expect there will be a lot of very practical and very interesting questions that will come up.
Yeah, it sounds like a big topic to be wrapping up the year with, and getting your plans in place for 2024. So it sounds like any employer in California, maybe a small band that isn't going to fall under this new guideline, but for most employers in California and the rest of the country, because it may be coming to a state near you if it's being rolled out in California. And then again, it sounds like very kind of complicated in that it will be integrated with all other aspects of your health and safety and worker wellness kind of plans. So definitely a big topic. Come prepared with all of your questions.
10 o'clock Pacific, and I think 1 o'clock Eastern.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Scott.